And so I'm explaining this one night. I'm doing a lecture in Baltimore with Dr. Patricia Newton. And she told me, because I didn't even know the term post-traumatic stress. I did not have that in my brain. And on that ride to the lecture, we came up with the term post-slavery. I worked it out, post-slavery trauma syndrome. That's different from what Joy writes in her book. And I did it at post. When we're talking about the post, we're talking about the past. We're talking about slavery. We were talking about the thing that caused this injury, right? And the trauma resulted from this injury, and the syndrome means that the trauma continues. That's why syndrome's got to be at the end, because it'll let you know the trauma that was caused by slavery in our past, it continues. So, trying to figure out, how do we get a solution to that? How do we resolve? What do we got to do? We have to then identify ourselves not as the pain giver, but as the pain receiver. So we can understand what caused the pain, who caused the pain. And that got to this concept of history, erasing the mystery. Because you've got to study history to really know who you are. It isn't just we were picking cotton. We were being murdered at will. We were being raped at will, men and women being raped and molested at will for hundreds of years on a daily basis by a population of people that made that level of genocide on another people their culture. And we now live in that culture trying to survive, not wanting to feel that pain, not wanting that hurt, that we become them to minimize it in our heads, in our spirits. How do we cleanse ourselves? And the only way I know is through history and a return to culture and return to our sacred science, African spiritual systems. I choose the route of going, when I left Islam, and I was actually, a lot of Muslims got angry with me because I was studying the Yoruba tradition even while I was an imam. And when Baba Surgiman and the others that lost their Yoruba home in 1970 in Harlem, I allowed them to meet in my mosque on a Sunday, which prompted a team of the good Muslim brothers to show up one morning at 3 in the morning for an assassination attempt on me, simply because I opened up the mosque to some other brothers who had no place to go in a building that we did not use on Sundays, which tells us part of what's wrong with our heads. But the blessing and the divine thing, I didn't die that morning because one of the young men who was in that group of 12 stepped in between one of the guns and me, because I buried his father 2 years before when his imam wouldn't do it because the father was a Muslim. So I raised that because I saw that as an African spiritual thing, because those same people went to Dar es Salaam Mosque in Brooklyn, in Queens rather, one of our sister mosques, a month later and killed 3 of our brothers while they were making salat. So they could have done that to me that morning. There's only 2 of us, 3 of us. I had locked Sister Ella, Malcolm's sister, in her room with a padlock on the door so they wouldn't think anybody was there. So it was just me and Brother Jerry when they rolled up on us that morning. But that Brother Jamil, whatever that spirit was, that let him stand in front of him and says, "Amen, Brother Small's a good man." And the brother jumped up and told the others, "Let's go." Even though I did have a weapon, and the weapon was on him, and I was going to go, but he would have gone with me. But I didn't see it as a me thing. I saw then their spirits, and we don't even understand how to deal with them. That we think only of the physical world. That's when I started getting deeper in African indigenous culture, because there's a spiritual world that is as real as the physical world.
I believe.
And so to come back to post-slavery trauma, we have to identify ourselves as the one who was being victimized not as the one who was doing the victimizing. And I think subconsciously we identify ourselves as the victimizer, so we victimize one another, instead of the one who's being victimized, so we can stop the mental process that leads to the victimization of one another. And that can only come from studying our history, studying our culture. And what I mean by culture, I'm talking about the value system that across the board in Africa that was placed on the life of human beings. The value that was placed on the life. The value that was placed on the life in Africa is the same value they place on God. Okay? That you are the essence of the divine. The Ewe had a word of saying it. It says Sogbe Lisa. The totality of creation is divinity. Sogbe Lisa. The totality of creation is divinity. And we are simply an expression of an aspect of the divine essence having this human experience. Yes. And that is very clear. So that's what, when I was talking about post-slavery traumas, how do we get back from there? How do we get back? And the way back is know your history, study your culture. The cultures that we have close to us, we have the Akan tradition, very prevalent in our community. We have some Congo tradition, but the big one we have is the Yoruba tradition. And we need to seek ways to study, and I'm not telling anybody to join any religious community, but I'm telling you to study with those who are in there who will allow you to study. And there's so much good literature out now, that you can get and begin to study. I think there's one good piece by a brother, Ifa Karade. When I met him many, many years ago, he lived here in East Orange. I don't know whether he's, where?
He's in the audience.
Okay. Well, it was his book, The Handbook on Yoruba Religion. I recommend to everybody. That's one of his books. There's a new edition? Okay. Because he wrote it like Elijah. He wrote it for us to understand how that system works. So if you can get Ifa Karade's book, and then Baba just said that there's a new edition, I think you would be that will open your eyes to how Africans saw the world of the divine and the human and the ecology and the cosmology that we are part of. And that would be a good beginning. Whom? Dr. Ben? Yeah, Dr. Ben have a couple of books out on African religion. What's the main one, the gray one? Yeah. Western religion. Dr. Ben was deeper than most people. People thought he start at Kemet, but he didn't. Kemet was just one of the most preserved manifestation of our physical culture display. But most people who study Kemet have not got into our theological or spiritual system because we don't know the language. But we know the Yoruba language is still being spoken, the Akan language is still being spoken. We can learn those languages to understand what the ancestors were saying. The beautiful thing about Kemet, because of the ecology, retained so much of what our ancestors left. But that wasn't our first civilization, nor probably our best civilization. It was just one of the longest lasting one because of the ecology. The Yoruba system is old. It's a very old system. It didn't start in West Africa. We came there from someplace. We've always been moving around Africa. And it wasn't just one manifestations, because the people who lived in the land we call Yoruba land today, when we got there, they had a way of knowing the divine. And we amalgamated and took the best of those systems and took it to a higher level. So when we study our history, we're going to learn a lot of things, you know. But that is right now the Yoruba is one of the largest ethnic nations in Africa, and it's one of the most preserved systems in the Western Hemisphere. You know, no matter where you go to Brazil, to Cuba, to Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, to South Carolina, to Florida, to Georgia. And then we have access today to bring the Nigerian understanding over to us because of modernity and technology and so forth.
Yes. Professor Small, I appreciate you, and I just want to start with giving thanks and praise to you for your sacrifice over the past decades and years that you've fought and struggled and made a continued effort and succeeded in being an exemplary example of what it means to be a representative of our ancestors. I greatly appreciate that on behalf of all young people on the planet Earth and in the African diaspora. My question relating to what you mentioned is culture being a tool of socialization. And I wanted to ask you, what are some instruments of socialization in your perspective that can be used at a local level in our present ecology to socialize and prepare our children for a liberated African future?
One of the things that we've lost is reverence and respect for elders and ancestors. The reverence and the respect for elders and ancestors, and particularly we've lost the knowledge of how to appreciate our ancestors as being real living beings. Right? I am the sum total of my mother and father. When they created me in their little sexual intercourse, the only thing they could create was themselves. So I am they. And they were my 4 and my 8, my 16 and so forth grandpeople. I am the culmination of all of them, and then my children is the extension of that culmination. So none of them have died because here I am. I am the ancestor I pour libation to. Okay. But how do we teach that? Then somebody said, well, what about your brothers and sisters? We're all aspect of mama and daddy, who is aspect of our 4 grandpeople and aspect of our 8 and our 16 and our 32 and our 64 and so forth. And guess what? When you go back, then you have to start coming down because the original ancestor is the divine itself. So we are indeed God having a human experience. How do we understand that? How do we explain that culturally? Because if your culture if its genesis isn't with your ancestors, what are you talking about? The genesis of your culture must be with your ancestors. What is it that your ancestors saw as sacred in the environment you're in? Why did the ancestor have a conversation with the tree? He's got to cut this poor tree down because he's got to build his house. But he doesn't just go and chop the tree down. He goes and he takes the tree some food. He says, oh, my dear brother or sister, I have brought you some nice fruits. I brought you some nice grain. I want to beg your forgiveness because I'm about to do something. And I will pour libation, explaining to the tree why I have to cut it down to use it. The mother said, the tree didn't hear nothing he said. But that's not true. Because that tree is a living being. That tree has life. My voice is vibration. It has my vibration. My breath is vibration. It feels my vibration. My vibration impacts and penetrates it. It can interpret it and understand it. So my relationship to the tree can't just be just a piece of log that I built a house with. That's my brother and that's my sister in nature. As much as you coming out of my mother's womb is my brother and my sister. That's African culture. How do we begin to understand it at that level and be informed by it? And that start with the most basic thing we can. Start with a book like Baba Karaday's book that's trying to explain to you what the spiritual system is, why is that, why we choose these colors, why this name, why these sounds, why this day. Because if you study Kemet, you'll see a lot of stuff in there about astronomy. But you'll also see a lot of stuff about astrology. But nobody ever makes the relationship. The astronomer is a scientist. He's a priest, or she's a priestess, right? Their job is to study cosmology and interpret it to the rest of us who raising the sheep, doing the fishing, planting the crops. We ain't got time to study all of the stars and the moons and the constellations, but they study it and tell us, okay, according to the movements we've observed, the best time for crop to grow is when this star is this way and this constellation this way and the sun is this way, right? The best time for you to get fish is when they're this way, this way, this way. So the priest and priestess master the science of cosmology. But how do they explain it to an illiterate population? Because we weren't literate then like we are today. They created something called astrology. Astrology was a methodology for explaining the science of astronomy to the masses. And when you begin to do the study like that, you see, like, oh, it's not so complicated at all. It's really not complicated. It's people working together doing different functions to explain cosmology and ecology to one another. And then practicing the laws and the rules in accordance with the laws and the rules that they've learned. So if you go to the average African community and they got a dance and there's drumming, from over here, all we do, we be jumping around because it's good sounding music. But, and I remember that happened to me once. I was just having a good dance. I didn't know that was a spiritual song. It was a trilogy on death, right? I was just enjoying myself because I didn't know the culture. I couldn't interpret the drums at that time. But people use the tools of culture, the drumming, the dancing, the dress, the colors, the drama, and the theater, and those things, to explain the rules and regulation by which they're living to one another. And sometimes it was betraying an ancestor who had perfected it and so forth, like in the Yoruba, we may talk about a Shango if we want to talk about how someone mastered and conquered the ego and the arrogance and so forth. You know, so you use these anthropomorphic symbols, animals or human beings, to explain concepts, ideas, and principles to yourself. And so learn how to study culture by reading our literature, reading literature by authors from home. Even the black church, if we studied it right, we'll find a lot of Africa there. Because where else did we have that we could hide it? We hid it there. But until you go to Africa in your research, you won't even recognize Africa that's in your living room. It's been there all the time. We never stopped being Africans. We forgot how to interpret the things that made us Africans. But those things are still in our environment. You know, they're still with us. But start with the revering of ancestors. Respect your mother. Respect your father. Respect your grandpeople, right? Who we have buried in the ground. But then respect the fact that they deposit themselves as genes as you before they went in the ground. Not just in you, but they deposited themselves as you before they went in the ground. So are they in the ground? An aspect of them is in the ground, the mineral part of them, but the energy part of them, the fire, recreated themselves as you. So we get a deeper understanding of that without getting confused. You'll be surprised how much they will have conversations with you, because they never went anywhere. They're with us. And they won't be having conversations like me, like I'm on a microphone talking to you. But you will know that you're receiving an understanding coming from an intelligent force that lives within you, that lived before you as you, as you are now living after them as them. Ancestors.